We're welcoming back onto the program today Chris Kluwe, former NFL football player who played 8 seasons with the Minnesota Vikings, lifelong gamer, provocateur at large, as he describes himself, and
positive improvement, disembodied I on the internet.
I think the sort of obvious first question is, let's see if we can figure out what each of you thinks that Gamergate, the Gamergate movement, is really about. Chris, I'll go to you first.
Sure. Well, in my view, based on all the factual evidence that I've seen, the Gamergate movement is a essentially quest set forth by Eran Gajoni to humiliate Zoe Quinn, who was his ex, and he shopped his rage story around to a couple different forums. Eventually got picked up on 4chan, then later moved to 8chan, and you had a bunch of people. Primarily Chan members orchestrating this behind the scenes, which can be seen in the IRC logs that Zoe collected over the span of about a month or so, that this originally started as a way to humiliate her. And then later, after they were getting pushback, they started the Operation Not Your Shield in an effort to make it seem like the movement was about more than just harassing a woman. And then once Adam Baldwin saw the YouTube video by, I believe it was Mundane Matt, he coined the term Gamergate, which people kind of glommed onto because Adam has a lot of followers. But at its core, the movement still remains a way for people to harass women, which is really unfortunate because I think that no one who opposes Gamergate has a problem with the idea of ethics in journalism. That's a goal everyone should aspire to. Our problem is that the means somehow seem to be more about harassing people than they do about actually seeking ethics in journalism. So that's how I view Gamergate, and I believe it's how a large majority of the world views Gamergate.
First off, I would need some proof here that Eran Gajoni had any kind of power whatsoever within Gamergate. I think if you actually look, you'd find no such evidence. Second, yes, indeed, from the best of my knowledge, at one point, some of the anonymous people who frequent 4chan and 8chan were seeking to find information on, mock, and generally cause trouble for a person they thought deserved this kind of negative treatment. What you seem to miss is that this kind of behavior is not unusual within Chan culture, and is not confined to Zoe Quinn or even to women. 5 minutes on the cow board on 8chan would have told you that. Third, Not Your Shield, however the name originated, has been used in actuality by female and minority supporters of Gamergate for the sole purpose of fighting against the characterization of Gamergate that you and those like you have been making, that Gamergate is a movement primarily focused on harassing women. Fourth, you seem to be assuming that Gamergate is primarily made up of, or is directed by the same people who were originally on 8chan shitposting about Zoe Quinn. Considering that the total number of people who currently support Gamergate greatly outnumbers the people who were talking about Quinn on 8chan, I would need to see some pretty strong evidence that Gamergate as a whole can be described as being for the purpose of harassing women. Are there anonymous people on 8chan or 4chan that are in this solely to harass, bother, or extract lulz from people they don't like, many of whom happen to be women? Sure. But those anonymous people are absolutely dwarfed by the average gamers who have come out in support of Gamergate because they are sick and tired of the behavior of the video game journalists. Fifth and finally, yes, the memes do seem to be about harassing people. But do you think maybe that's because the video games media wants it to seem that way? Could it be that any attempts to enforce ethics within video games journalism would be met with baseless slander such as the things you're repeating here against Gamergate? And no, Chris, most of the world has never even heard of Gamergate and doesn't care about it at all.
So so we can establish some facts. Chris,
I would actually like to raise a couple points there.
I will absolutely let you, but before we do that, do you believe, Chris, that there is a concern about ethics in journalism from those who claim to have that concern? I'll let you answer that first.
Yes, I do believe there are people in Gamergate who are concerned about ethics in journalism. I think that number is growing smaller every day as they see what the core of the movement is about. And I think that there is no problem with having a concern about ethics in video game journalism. I think there should be discussion about ethics in video game journalism.
Could it be that the number is growing smaller because there are less ethical concerns now, because Gamergate has actually achieved many of its goals? No, it must be because people are convinced Gamergate is all about harassing women. Sure, Chris. And you claim to have no problem with people being concerned about ethics in video game journalism, yet any time someone tries to talk about it, they are treated as though they are a horrible person because people like you have poisoned the well.
So I think the first assertion that is troubling is the idea that there was the idea of collusion inside the Zoe post that Yaron Gajoni posted, and the actual factual matter of that is that those claims were investigated and it was found that nothing had happened. There was no big write-up of Depression Quest by Nathan Grayson. That didn't happen. He mentioned it once because it was a game at an indie game jam, and then there was no other mention of it. So the idea that this thing was because of collusion, well, the facts aren't there to back it up. The other idea that Gamergate started with was Zoe Quinn slept with 5 guys in order to get her game reviewed. That's why their IRC channel was called Burger and Fries. It was a reference to 5 guys. Again, no factual basis for that whatsoever. The only reason it existed was to harass Zoe Quinn and to make her feel horrible about herself. So I find it troubling that there's this thought that Gamergate somehow had this noble purpose that arose from the Zoe post when all along the facts are there. It was completely about harassing Zoe Quinn, and it still is about harassing Zoe Quinn. Mike Cernovich just the other day posted harassment of Zoe Quinn. Milo Yiannopoulos just the other day posted harassment of Zoe Quinn. You can shake your head all you want, but the facts are right there online.
Okay, so Chris, you've just shown that you don't actually know all the facts, because Nathan Grayson actually mentioned Zoe Quinn's game in 2 separate articles at the time, not just one. But what you're doing here is a common anti-Gamergate tactic, which is to make it seem like the Zoe Quinn, Nathan Grayson stuff is the only ethical concern that Gamergate has, when in reality, the Zoe post was and is simply just one of many such examples. For your narrative to make any sense, you and people like you have to keep bringing up Quinn. So the only reason she still gets targeted at all is because people like you keep making her relevant to the conversation by claiming that Gamergate's entire purpose is to attack some indie game developer that no one would otherwise care about. And that's simply ridiculous on the face of it when you look at the actual number of people who are participating in the hashtag.
As you say, Gamergate is against harassment. Gamergate is not about harassment. So when this board, Baphomet, starts targeting GG targets, and then all of a sudden they start exposing people's personal information, mine included, I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to say to Gamergate, if they are truly against harassment, to denounce a board that is targeting people that, oddly enough, 90% of which oppose Gamergate.
So you want to hold Gamergate responsible when anyone you perceive of as a Gamergate target receives harassment or is doxxed. So if random trolls who don't care about video games start harassing, say, Ben Kuchera, Gamergate is responsible for denouncing it and trying to stop it, because if we don't, people like you will assume we support that harassment. Sorry, but you don't get to make it the default that Gamergate supports harassment unless they explicitly denounce it. Imagine doing that to any other group. It would never be acceptable, so nice try.
All right, Chris, we'll let you respond to that, and then I think we'll be able to, I don't know how much further we'll be able to get on this. We can transition into our next topic. Go ahead, Chris.
So what would you say then that the owner of the Baphomet board was a Gamergate supporter, as proved by his own Facebook page?
What would you say if a person convicted of murder turned out to be a supporter of social justice and feminism? I guess feminists everywhere should have to apologize for that person's actions, right? You can't hold an entire group accountable for the actions of every random person who supports the group. Now, if the owner of Baphomet turned out to be Sargon of Akkad or Oliver Campbell, and Gamergate as a whole continued to support them, then you might have a point.
Chris, if I were to say to you, if you're supposed to, sort of on balance going to tell us the doxing has been 50-50 or it's been 60-40 or what have you, talk to us a little bit about your view on that.
I'd say it's an impossible question to answer because there isn't 2 sides. There's Gamergate and there's everyone else in the world. And everyone else in the world doesn't fall into one side. There are people who oppose Gamergate who use methods I don't agree with. I've said so. There are people who oppose Gamergate whose methods I do agree with. I've said so. I don't think doxing is an appropriate tactic. I've seen far more Gamergate happening to people who oppose Gamergate than doxing has happened to people who support Gamergate. So I would say that Gamergaters tend to dox a lot more than the people who oppose them, again, who aren't necessarily a side. They are just people elsewhere in the world who see something happening and say, we don't think that is okay, that people are getting harassed.
Again, Chris, most of the world either hasn't heard of or doesn't care about Gamergate. Stop pretending like you've got the whole world on your side. And I think you're going to have to provide some proof that the doxing that's happened to Gamergate opponents was done by Gamergate supporters rather than random trolls. Just as Gamergate would have to prove that doxing done to one of their supporters was done by someone who is actively opposing Gamergate. Finally, if anti-Gamergate is defined by those who say, I don't think it's okay that people are being harassed, then most Gamergate supporters could actually be defined as anti-Gamergate by that definition.
Chris, so let me let you address that. Is there an anti-Gamergate, or is there just everybody who's not in Gamergate?
Well, if the New York Times, Ars Technica, Kotaku, Game Informer, Polygon, who else? Mother Jones, the Daily Kos, a wide variety of other websites, if they've all written articles illustrating the problems with Gamergate and why it is harassment of people, I'm going to say that conspiracy has a whole lot of members. I mean, there's a lot of people, or, it could be reptoids. We don't know. They could be pulling our strings behind the curtains. I mean, that's one thing Gamergate's never short of, is the red line conspiracy charts. I've seen more than a few of those.
So if a consumer revolt focused on fighting against corruption in the media is slandered by the media, that's supposed to be proof that everyone in the world is opposed to Gamergate? Do you think it's really so implausible that the video games media, rather than admitting that they are horribly corrupt, made up a narrative stating that the campaign criticizing them is actually a hate group targeting women? Do you really think that corrupt journalists would never do such a thing? And as for the mainstream news, who do you think they're likely to believe? Their fellow journalists, or the people angry at said journalists?
Chris also wanted to talk about the connection between gender and Gamergate in what he feels is an overlap between anti-feminist and men's rights activist groups with the pro-Gamergate side. Let's go back first to Chris this time. Talk to us about why you believe this overlap exists.
I believe the overlap exists because you look at the people who are attracted to Gamergate and who Gamergate holds up as voices, and a vast majority of them are men's rights activists or people who have a vested interest in speaking out against feminism. Mike Cernovich, for example, men's rights activist. Roosh V, men's rights activist. Vox Day, men's rights activist and horrible human being. There are plenty more examples of people. I mean, you had Stormfront, you had the literal Nazi party wanting to ally itself with Gamergate because they liked what they saw. And there's something to be said about, if your movement is defined by all these people wanting to join up and they all share these similar traits that really don't treat other people well, that says something about your movement and what its espoused values are. No matter what you think they are, people judge things based on their actions, and Gamergate's actions have attracted a very specific sort of person.
So Mike Cernovich, Roosh V, and Vox Day are the people Gamergate holds up as voices? If that's so, why are they not the ones that Gamergate wants to send to talk to the SPJ panel? Could it be that you're just cherry-picking names of Gamergate supporters you don't like? There's a very good reason why a lot of anti-feminist and men's rights activists have joined Gamergate. It's because one aspect of Gamergate is a fight against the influence of radical feminists and so-called social justice warriors on video games. What does that have to do with ethics in game journalism, you ask? If you take a look at the type of ethical violations and the type of ideology that gets needlessly injected into video game reviews, it is almost without exception the ideology of radical feminism and radical social justice. If game journalism had been showing corruption based on an extreme right-wing bias, you'd currently be seeing a lot of radical liberals joining the movement. Since it's a feminist or social justice bias we're seeing, Gamergate naturally attracts those most opposed to those ideologies. Just as feminism attracts people who hate men, and Christianity attracts people who hate homosexuals, and atheism attracts people who hate religion.
What specific actions do you believe have attracted these groups?
I think they're their willingness to go after who they perceive as an SJW, social justice warrior, which used to be just someone that was a keyboard warrior who would get upset at a cause but then never do anything about it, but has now grown to encompass basically everything that MRAs and PUAs don't like. I think it's interesting that Gamergate doesn't want to take its activism offline. It doesn't want to, this meetup was the first thing, and I will agree with you. The bomb threat was completely unconscionable. That's something that should never happen. But I think it's interesting. That was the first time Gamergate met up in any meaningful capacity, when that's the main complaint against SJWs, is that they never do anything offline. They never take any strides. And so I really feel that Gamergate's history of harassing people and of providing this willful ignorance about how their actions are perceived, it makes for some very fertile recruiting ground for people who generally don't have everyone else's best interests in mind.
I don't think you know what social justice warrior means, Chris. Social justice warriors do stuff offline all the time. That's not the main criticism of them. The main criticism of them is that they take traditional liberal and feminist values to an authoritarian extreme. They get the moniker warrior because they act as though they are fighting some kind of holy war against what they perceive to be injustices in the world.
How's that sounding to you, Chris?
Not quite matching up with reality, because Christina Hoff Sommers, since you brought her up, she calls herself an equity feminist, and she has been widely denounced by 99% of other feminists as not knowing what the hell she's talking about. I mean, she has her cushy job at the Heritage Foundation, and I think it's the Heritage Foundation, where she gets to be the talking head that lets people think that their ideas aren't that bad.
The name you were going for there, Chris, was the American Enterprise Institute. And just so you know, someone could point to almost any popular person and claim that they just allow the people supporting them to think that their ideas are not that bad. Have you considered, Chris, that people are individuals with brains who are capable of thinking for themselves, and that having evaluated what people like you say, and what people like Christina Hoff Sommers say, they've decided that what she says makes a lot more sense.
Chris, what do you think? First, on the idea that Gamergate has achieved its goals, and then as to what you would need to see in order to say, I'm comfortable with a kind of de-escalation.
I agree with you. Gamergate should be wound down. Gamergate should, if you feel that they have accomplished their goal of ethics in game journalism, that sites have gotten these new guidelines and that they're going to behave ethically, I think that is a perfectly valid thing, and let's let Gamergate disappear. The unfortunate reality is that people are still getting targeted. Zoe Quinn still cannot return to her home. Brianna Wu still gets hundreds of hateful messages every day. Anita Sarkeesian gets hundreds of hateful messages every day. And if Gamergate wants to be about ethics in video game journalism, and this is something I've been saying since October, the only way you're going to do that is to have a group that is accountable, that has methods of keeping itself accountable. That means you need to have a member list. You need to have a way to contact people. You need to have a way to meet up in real life. And I see you shaking your head, but that's the truth. If you don't have accountability, your group is defined by the actions of everyone in it, because you can't say otherwise. You can't say, oh, well, this part of Gamergate's okay, and we really didn't do that. You have no way of knowing which people are doing that. It's an amorphous hashtag. That's what Gamergate has always said. That's what you said. You said it's an online hashtag. That's all it is. There is no accountability in an online hashtag. So if you want this to actually be about ethics in game journalism, there has to be accountability. That is a fact of the real world. Otherwise, the same stuff's going to continue happening.
Yes, that's true. As long as Gamergate continues to be an amorphous hashtag, people like you will continue to mischaracterize it as a hate movement, and without creating a formal organization, there's no way to stop that. But you're certainly wrong when you try to claim that formally organizing is the only way to achieve our goals. Opponents of Gamergate want us to organize so that it's easier to attack us. If we had a formal organization, people like you, Chris, would be able to dig up all sorts of stuff on the official leadership and then use that to slander the whole organization and force us to conform to your wishes. As long as we're an amorphous hashtag, we can focus on what we think is important, and dismiss criticism of people like you who want to control how we go about achieving ethics in game journalism. And the very idea that we require formal organization to be successful is ludicrous, considering how much has already been achieved with things the way they are. As for the harassment that these women face, all I can say is, welcome to being a controversial figure on the internet. If you don't want to be the target of harassment, you have a few options. You can first try and not say controversial things. Or you can try and remain anonymous, like me. Or you can try and remain obscure enough that nobody cares what you have to say, like me. Sadly, though, if you're someone who journalists interview and write articles about, and you have any kind of strong beliefs, you are going to end up being the target of trolls or other immature people. That's the reality of the world we live in, and it's not something that can be blamed on Gamergate.
Well, see, it's interesting you say that because I'm a public figure as well, so I know exactly what you're talking about, and I can promise you the stuff that Gamergate is doing is so far beyond what people get on a normal everyday basis that it is... I spoke out on same-sex equality, okay, in Minnesota, and I had hundreds of letters from people disagreeing with me, many times in small single-spaced print. And they were not nearly a tenth as vile as what Gamergate supporters have sent me on a daily basis.
That's interesting. So, Chris, what you're saying is when you were on the Vikings, when you were a football player on the Vikings, and you got a lot of attention when you spoke out in favor of gay rights, positive and negative attention, as I recall, you would be on the receiving end of some anti-gay bigotry. But you're saying that even though at the time you were sort of operating at a national level playing football, that compared to from your involvement in Gamergate, the harassment paled in comparison. That's what you're saying.
Correct. And I have the entire box of letters of everything that I was sent because I enjoy reading some of them sometimes because some of them are pretty funny. But looking at those letters and then looking at tweets people have sent me, comments people have made, there is no comparison. Gamergate is by far worse than the... and let's be clear, we're talking about the anti-gay faction of America who not really known for their nice habits. Gamergate is worse than them. And I have that as a factual evidence. I have the letters from both sides.
Could there perhaps be a reason that your letters from religious fundamentalists were less nasty than tweets from anonymous people on the internet? First off, there's the obvious factor of anonymity, but then again, it's perfectly possible to be anonymous in a letter. So let's look at the people involved. The people who are opposed to gay rights, such as marriage, generally have those beliefs for religious reasons. I think we can agree on that. Now, there are certainly examples to be found of very nasty religious people, but I'd say in general, religious people have been raised with certain moral values that would prevent them from being overly nasty and mean to you in letters. When you're talking about anonymous internet trolls, though, these are more likely to be people experienced in the kind of language that gets used commonly in the depths of the internet. In my experience, the more time someone spends on sites like 4chan or 8chan or even Reddit, the more likely they are to be familiar with language that the average person we consider to be pretty nasty. When such a person goes to insult or troll someone like you, Chris, they are going, of course, to use that nasty language they have learned online. And that's language that a religious fundamentalist might not know or be willing to use because of their religious beliefs.
Let's, if we can, what do we all agree on? You both did agree that harassment and doxing has taken place. You've both agreed that, to differing degrees, there are people out there who truly are most concerned about ethics in game journalism. And it sounds like in different ways you've both agreed that there should be a wind down to Gamergate, albeit for drastically different reasons. Chris, am I missing any other key elements of agreement that you two have had?
No, I think that about covers it. I think the main reason that me and many others oppose Gamergate is not because of the idea of ethics in video game journalism. It's because of the factual evidence that people have been harassed over this. And until that stops, then I'm not going to stop speaking out against it because these are people's lives we're talking about. I mean, these are people who are being negatively affected by this. And I don't think that that is a thing that we should accept from ourselves as a society.
So as long as, for example, Anita Sarkeesian continues to claim she receives harassment, you are going to continue to blame Gamergate for it and continue to fight against Gamergate. Well, Chris, I've got news for you. You're never going to stop fighting then, because as long as there is free speech online, controversial people are going to receive harassment, just as controversial people receive harassment outside of the internet. And thus ends our debate. I hope everyone enjoyed watching it. So like, dislike, subscribe, or share as you see fit, and I wish you all the best.